I had always been a night owl, so driving through the night as a trucker didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude of the highway, the distant hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of the tires on the road. There was something peaceful about it, something that made me feel like I had the whole world to myself. But that night, the peace turned into a nightmare I still can't shake, one that haunts me whenever I close my eyes. It started around 2 a.m. I was barreling down a desolate stretch of highway in Nevada, miles of open roads stretching endlessly into the darkness. The stars above twinkled faintly, the only light aside from my headlights piercing the pitch-black void ahead. The night felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the universe is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes. There, on the side of the road, stood a hitchhiker, her thumb outstretched. I squinted, trying to make sense of the figure. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this ungodly hour? Hitchhikers weren't exactly common on this stretch of highway. In fact, I hadn't seen a single soul for hours. Yet, there she was. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. A woman, maybe in her mid-30s, dressed in a tattered white dress that billowed slightly in the breeze. Her hair hung limply over her shoulders, matted and dirty. There was something wrong with the way she stood, so still, so expectant. Her pale face was illuminated by the glow of my headlights, and the closer I got, the more unsettled I became. She looked sick, almost ghostly, her skin ashen and her eyes hollow, as if she hadn't seen daylight in weeks. I should have kept driving. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to keep my foot on the gas, to not get involved, but something about her drew me in, a strange, unexplainable pull. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to bore into me, desperate and pleading. Against every instinct I had, I slowed down and pulled over. The woman didn't say a word as she climbed into the passenger seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost robotic. She sat down without so much as a glance in my direction, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just tired or traumatized. People react to things in different ways, I told myself. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the thick, uncomfortable silence. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken. Her silence was unnerving, but I figured maybe she'd been through something bad. I'd heard stories of people hitchhiking to escape dangerous situations. I didn't want to press her. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the soft purr of the engine and the tires on the road. But the longer we drove, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't help but sneak glances at her. There was something wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, and there was a faint smell in the air, something sour and rotten. At first I thought it was just the staleness of the truck after hours on the road, but the smell got stronger, like decay. As the minutes ticked by, the air in the cab felt heavier, thicker, as if the darkness outside was seeping in, suffocating us. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. I could feel her presence next to me, cold and unnatural, like the air around her had dropped a few degrees. Every fiber of my being was telling me to get out, to stop the truck and leave her there. But I didn't. I couldn't. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her head turning slowly to face me. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. "No," I lied, my voice sounding too thin, too fragile in the suffocating darkness. She smiled then, a slow, eerie grin that spread across her face like something unnatural. "You should," she whispered, her voice lingering in the air long after the words had left her lips. That's when everything went wrong. The temperature in the truck plummeted, the warmth I'd felt earlier vanishing in an instant. My breath misted in front of me, and the radio, which had been silent the entire trip, crackled to life. Static filled the airwaves, but beneath it, I could hear faint voices, whispers. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like people were talking, but their words were garbled, like they were coming from somewhere far away. Or maybe from somewhere else entirely. The headlights flickered, casting the highway in erratic flashes of light and shadow, and then the road ahead seemed to warp, stretching out endlessly like a tunnel with no end. Panic gripped me as I realized I couldn't tell if I was still moving forward or if I was stuck in place, driving nowhere. I stole a glance at the woman, and my blood ran cold. She wasn't sitting in the seat anymore. Instead, she was hovering above it, her body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, her limbs bent at impossible angles, and her face. God, her face. It was no longer human. Her eyes had turned pitch black, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The smell of decay filled the cab, overwhelming, suffocating. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt with a violent jerk. The woman let out a sound, a high-pitched, otherworldly scream that reverberated through the air, vibrating my bones. I threw the door open and stumbled out, my heart racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. When I turned back, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the smell of decay lingering like a ghostly reminder of her presence. I stood there, trembling, staring at the empty cab, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I jumped back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and gunned the engine, speeding off into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I checked the passenger seat constantly, expecting her to reappear at any moment. I haven't driven down that stretch of highway since, but even now, whenever I'm alone on the road late at night, I can feel her presence. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is quiet and the static hums through the radio, I hear her voice, soft, almost gentle, whispering just beneath the surface. You should.
My route often took me through some pretty desolate areas, long stretches of lonely highway where the only company I had was the hum of my engine and the distant stars overhead. It wasn't unusual for me to go hours without seeing another vehicle, and I was used to the isolation. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it most of the time, but none of those experiences prepared me for this one stretch of highway in the Midwest, a route I would come to dread and avoid at all costs. The landscape was unforgiving, flat, endless fields stretching out on either side of the road as far as the eye could see. Not a single tree or building in sight, just an ocean of darkness broken only by the faint glow of the moon. I had been driving for hours, pushing through the night, and the isolation was beginning to get to me. There wasn't even the occasional farmhouse light or the flicker of a town on the horizon to break the monotony. Just me, my truck, and the void. As the hours ticked by, I felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in. My eyes were getting heavy, and my mind wandered, dipping in and out of focus as the miles slipped away beneath my tires. I knew I needed to stop soon, to rest and recharge before I made a mistake on the road. But there were no gas stations or truck stops in sight. Nothing but darkness stretching ahead. That's when I finally saw the sign. A rest stop, 5 miles ahead. Relief flooded through me. It wasn't much, just one of those old, forgotten places that seemed to have been left behind by time. But it was better than nothing. I could at least stretch my legs, maybe catch a few hours of sleep in the cab before continuing on. As the miles dwindled, I imagined the cool night air, the stiffness leaving my body as I stepped out to breathe in the stillness. The rest stop came into view, an isolated patch of cracked pavement with a couple of picnic tables and a small cinder block restroom building. It was the kind of place that had probably seen a lot of use in the 1970s, but had since been abandoned by most travelers, left to decay in the middle of nowhere. The single light above the restroom door flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the lot. I pulled my truck into one of the spaces, the engine rumbling softly as I sat there for a moment, taking in the desolate scene. The place was completely deserted. No surprise there. It was miles from anywhere, and no sane person would choose to stop here in the dead of night. But I had little choice, and despite the growing unease that settled in my gut, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the cab. The silence hit me immediately. There were no sounds, no crickets, no wind, no distant cars. Just an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow everything around me. I shook off the discomfort, chalking it up to fatigue. I'd been on the road for almost 12 hours straight, and I was probably just paranoid. As I stretched my legs, I debated whether I should use the restroom, but something about the building gave me the creeps. It was old and crumbling, with the flickering light barely illuminating the entrance. The shadows seemed too deep, too thick, as if they were hiding something. I decided to hold it and just sleep in the truck. But as I turned back toward my rig, something caught my eye. Standing just beyond the edge of the dim light was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in ragged clothes. He was standing still, half shrouded in darkness, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I thought maybe he was another traveler who had pulled in after me. But there were no other vehicles, and I hadn't heard anyone approach. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky despite my attempt to sound casual. "You need something?" No response. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stood there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Something was very, very wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, suffocating. The man's presence felt unnatural, like he wasn't really there, but somehow more real than anything else around me. I backed up slowly, my eyes locked on the figure as I moved toward my truck. He still didn't move, but I could feel his gaze burning into me, like he was willing me to come closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and my instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there. Whatever this was, I didn't want to find out. I jumped into the cab, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I started the engine, and as the headlights flicked on, they illuminated the spot where the man had been standing. But he was gone. My blood ran cold. He had vanished, disappeared into the darkness without a sound. I scanned the rest stop, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't wait around to find out if he would come back. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, the tires screeching against the pavement as I sped back onto the highway. My heart was still racing, and the adrenaline coursing through my veins made it hard to focus. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the rest stop, watching me as I disappeared into the night. He wasn't there. But the feeling of dread followed me. It clung to me like a shadow, heavy and suffocating, as if the darkness itself was alive and watching. The farther I drove, the more intense it became, until I felt like I was being crushed under its weight. The night seemed to press in on me from all sides, the road ahead swallowed by a blackness that felt more like a presence than an absence. Then, I saw it. In the mirrors, just barely visible in the glow of my taillights, was the figure. He was standing in the middle of the road, impossibly far from where I had last seen him. But there he was, smaller and smaller as I sped away, but still there. My heart skipped a beat. He couldn't have followed me. There was no way. But there he was, standing motionless in the middle of the road, like a dark silhouette against the night. And somehow, I knew he was still watching me. I floored the gas pedal, the truck roaring as it picked up speed. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, and my eyes flicked constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors behind. But no matter how fast I drove, the sense that I was being followed never left. It was like he was always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the headlights, waiting for me to stop. I didn't stop again that night. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed and my body trembling. I had driven straight through, too terrified to pull over. When I finally saw a truck stop up ahead, I pulled in and parked, my body sagging with relief. The sunlight felt like a shield, a barrier between me and the oppressive darkness I had escaped. But even then, as I sat there in the cab, staring out at the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing just beyond the edge of the light waiting for me. He wasn't there. But I knew he was out there somewhere, waiting. I still drive that route sometimes, but I've never stopped at that rest stop again. I avoid it like the plague. and I've even started planning my trips so that I don't have to drive at night. But no matter how much I try to put it behind me, I can't escape the memory of that night. And every now and then, when I'm out on those lonely highways, I feel it again, that sense of being watched. And when I look in the rearview mirror, I swear I see a figure, standing just beyond the light, too far to see clearly, but close enough to feel.
Long hauls were my bread and butter, and I had driven through some of the loneliest, most remote parts of the country. Highways that stretched on endlessly, winding through desolate deserts, vast forests, and barren plains with no towns or signs of life in sight for hundreds of miles. These roads became my second home. I thought I had seen it all: storms, empty landscapes that stretched out like an ocean, and the occasional eerie, abandoned gas station. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the trip through Wyoming. That stretch of road would forever haunt me. It was nearing midnight, and the sky was a pitch-black canvas, dotted only by a few faint stars. My rig was the only thing moving for miles, the headlights carving a narrow tunnel of light through the darkness. The truck's engine hummed beneath me, steady, constant, and the tires thrummed rhythmically against the pavement. I found that hum comforting. It drowned out the loneliness of these drives, made the endless silence bearable. But as I cruised along that narrow two-lane highway, surrounded by nothing but open plains and the occasional distant silhouette of mountains, something felt different. The road was empty, not another vehicle in sight. No headlights in the distance, no taillights fading ahead. Just me and the night. I had been on the road for hours, and my mind had settled into that familiar, almost meditative state that long-haul drivers know all too well, half focused on the road, half lost in thought. But out of nowhere, a sudden feeling washed over me, sharp and cold. I felt as if I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off as nerves. I'd been through worse stretches of road, places that felt even more isolated than this. But the sensation grew stronger, prickling at the back of my neck. My hands tightened on the wheel as I fought the urge to look in the rearview mirror. Something told me I wouldn't like what I'd see. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I flicked my eyes up to the mirror, expecting to see nothing but empty road behind me. But there, in the red glow of my taillights, stood a man. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, standing dead center in the middle of the road, motionless. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared at him, illuminated by the faint light of my truck, a shadowy figure that hadn't been there moments before. For a split second, I thought maybe he was a stranded motorist, someone who needed help. It was possible, though unlikely, given where I was. But the longer I looked at him, the more I realized something was off. He wasn't moving, not waving me down, not signaling for help, just standing there, as still as a statue. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and there was no sign of a broken-down car or any reason for him to be out there on this desolate stretch of highway. A cold chill crept up my spine, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tore my eyes away from the mirror, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. My heart was still pounding, but I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. After all, how could he have gotten there without me seeing him approach? But the feeling of being watched never left me. In fact, it intensified. I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the mirror again, half expecting to see him gone. But there he was, still standing in the middle of the road, still watching me. It didn't matter how far I drove or how fast I went. He didn't move. His figure remained the same size in the mirror, as if he was frozen in place, locked in that same eerie position. By the time an hour had passed, the tension in my chest was unbearable. My hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my breath came in shallow, uneasy gulps. I kept telling myself to stop thinking about it, to let it go, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. It was like he had etched himself into my brain, a shadow that I couldn't shake. Finally, I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead. The thought of stopping, even for a moment, felt like relief. I needed to clear my head, stretch my legs, and convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe I was overtired, pushing myself too hard. The rest stop was deserted when I pulled in. A single flickering street lamp cast long shadows over the cracked pavement, and the building itself looked run down, as if no one had bothered to maintain it in years. I parked my rig and sat there for a moment, the engine idling softly as I stared out at the empty lot. The night felt unnaturally still, like the air itself was holding its breath. With a sigh, I turned off the engine and climbed out of the cab. The cold night air hit me like a slap, refreshing but eerie in its stillness. As I stretched my legs and walked around to check the tires, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. But they were there, unmistakable, growing closer. My blood ran cold as I turned, fully expecting to see someone, a fellow trucker, a late-night traveler. But the lot was empty. No one was there. My heart was pounding now, thudding in my ears as I stood frozen in place, scanning the lot for any sign of movement. But it was dead quiet, the only sound the gentle wind whispering through the empty plains. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been driving too long. I was tired, paranoid. But then, I saw him again. At the edge of the lot, near the entrance to the rest stop, stood the man from the road. He was closer now, much closer than he had been before, but still just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. His silhouette was eerily still, like a dark shadow cut from the night. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt an icy tendril of fear creep through my veins. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in some sort of silent standoff. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the next move, daring me to come closer, to acknowledge him. I didn't. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the truck, my legs pumping furiously beneath me. My boots barely touched the ground as I sprinted back to the cab, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't dare risk it. All I could think about was getting back into the truck, locking the doors, and getting the hell out of there. Once I was safely inside, I slammed the doors shut and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I started the engine, threw the truck into gear, and peeled out of the rest stop as fast as I could. My heart was still racing, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I sped down the highway, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But the nightmare wasn't over. Even as I drove, the unease never left me. No matter how fast I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that rest stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, and there he was, standing by the side of the road, his figure barely illuminated by the glow of my taillights. Sometimes he was ahead of me, standing in the distance, waiting, always waiting. I never saw his face clearly, but the glimpses I caught sent shivers down my spine. His eyes, they weren't right. They were hollow, dark, like empty pits that swallowed the light around them. His body moved in a way that wasn't natural, like he was bound by some otherworldly force, not the rules of the physical world. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, I was a wreck. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I hadn't stopped driving, hadn't dared to pull over for the rest of the night. The exhaustion weighed heavy on my bones, but the fear kept me going. The man had vanished with the dawn, but his presence still clung to me like a shadow. When I finally pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of a small town, I collapsed in the cab, shaking and exhausted. I told myself it was over, that I was safe now, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. He was still out there, waiting, watching. I never spoke of what happened to anyone, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Every time I get behind the wheel, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there again, waiting for me. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the darkness presses in, I feel his eyes on me, watching, always watching.
I've been hiking for years, mostly solo trips, and I've never had an issue. The solitude of the forest, the crisp air, and the feeling of being so far from civilization are addictive. But after my last hike, I don't think I'll ever go alone again. It started off like any other hike. I was on a remote trail in the Pacific Northwest, known for its sweeping views, towering trees, and dense fog-covered forests. That morning, the mist was especially thick, curling around the trunks like ghostly fingers, shrouding everything in a heavy silence that was almost suffocating. It was beautiful, but something felt off. A weight hung in the air, pressing down on me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, it's easy to let your mind wander when you're so isolated. I had just reached the top of a steep incline when I first saw it. A figure standing far off on the ridge, partially obscured by the fog. It was hard to make out any details from that distance, but something about the way it stood there, utterly still, made my stomach drop. At first, I thought it was another hiker. I stopped, catching my breath, and waited for some kind of movement, maybe a wave or a nod. But the figure didn't budge. It stood motionless, staring in my direction. A chill crawled up my spine as I realized just how unnatural it looked, how utterly devoid of life. I forced myself to wave, expecting some kind of acknowledgement. Nothing, just staring. My hand faltered, dropping to my side, and a wave of unease washed over me. I decided to move on, telling myself it was just my imagination. Or maybe a trick of the light playing off the mist. But as I descended into the valley below, I kept glancing back, and each time my heart would skip a beat. The figure was still there, still standing on the ridge, still facing me. And then it moved, but not like a person. It didn't walk or run, it just shifted. 1 second it was on the ridge, and the next it was closer, like it had blinked through the fog. That's when my pulse quickened, my breath growing shallow. Paranoia gripped me, tightening around my chest like a vice. I felt eyes on me, always watching, always just out of sight. My pace quickened, my steps becoming uneven as I pushed through the undergrowth, the trees closing in around me. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The forest became darker, the mist thicker, and the air colder. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every snap of a twig felt like a death sentence. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew I wasn't alone. The figure, whatever it was following me. I didn't know how, but it was always there, always just out of view, waiting for me to look away. When I did, it moved faster than I thought possible. One moment I'd catch a glimpse of it far behind me, and the next, it was in front, always watching, always waiting. As the sun started to set, casting long, twisted shadows over the trail, I knew I was running out of time. I needed to reach my camp before dark, but the figure seemed to know my path. It was there, standing in the distance, barely visible through the thickening fog, and it wasn't alone anymore. Other shapes began to emerge from the mist, indistinct, dark figures all staring in my direction, all motionless. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized they were surrounding me, slowly closing in like a predator toying with its prey. I panicked. I thought I could shake them by going off trail, cutting through the thick underbrush in a desperate attempt to lose them. But that only made things worse. The trees twisted and bent unnaturally as if the forest itself was working against me, guiding me deeper into its heart, trapping me. My mind was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The figures followed, moving closer every time I blinked. My flashlight flickered, casting wild, jittery beams of light across the trees. And then I saw it, a glimpse of the figure's face for the first time. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, far too wide, with rows of teeth that looked sharp enough to tear flesh from bone. I ran, I didn't care where, as long as it was away from those things. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even think. All I knew was that if I slowed down, if I hesitated for even a second, they would be on me. I could feel them behind me, their cold breath on my neck, their fingers grazing the back of my shirt. I tripped. My foot caught on something, a root or a rock, and I went down hard. My flashlight tumbled from my hand, its beam spinning wildly before it blinked out, leaving me in total darkness. My head slammed into the ground, and for a moment everything went black. When I came to, the forest was deathly silent. The figures were gone, but I wasn't safe. I could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my entire body trembling, covered in mud and scratches. I couldn't see the trail anymore. I couldn't see anything but the thick fog that wrapped around me like a noose. I stumbled blindly through the darkness, my heart pounding in my ears. The road at the trailhead felt impossibly far. I knew I'd never make it. But then, just as the last of my hope began to slip away, I saw a light. It was faint, flickering in the distance, but it was enough. I ran toward it, praying with every ounce of strength I had left that it was someone, anyone who could help. But as I got closer, the light began to shift, to change. It wasn't a campfire or a flashlight. It was the figure, and now it was standing directly in my path, its hollow eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Its grin widened, splitting its face in half, and I knew, whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It never had been. The last thing I remember is that grin, that awful, twisted grin as everything went black again. I woke up hours later, covered in dirt and blood, alone. The hike back was a blur, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about what followed me that night. I'm not sure it's gone. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel it, those eyes, that grin watching me from the shadows. I don't think I'll ever hike alone again.
My friend Mike and I had always been adventure seekers, pushing the limits of our courage. So when we decided to hike through the remote slot canyons of Utah, it felt like just another daring escapade. The place was known for its breathtaking beauty. Smooth, narrow walls, twisting and turning, sometimes just a few feet wide, making it feel like we were walking through the veins of some ancient creature. The isolation was part of the appeal. A world untouched by modern life. A place where you could lose yourself, literally and figuratively. We set out early, our backpacks heavy with gear, planning to camp overnight in the canyon before looping back. By mid-afternoon, we entered one of the most isolated sections. The towering sandstone walls closed in, making it impossible to see the sky. The temperature dropped as the canyon deepened, and the shadows stretched longer, almost unnaturally so, like they were alive, slowly creeping toward us. The deeper we ventured, the quieter it got. Eerily so. No wind, no birds, just the sound of our boots crunching against the sand. That's when the noises started. At first it was faint, like a gentle hum riding the canyon's natural acoustics, barely noticeable over the echo of our footsteps. But as we moved forward, the noise changed, evolving into something more distinct. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Whispers. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Do you hear that?" I asked Mike.
my voice sounding small in the vast canyon. Mike didn't respond immediately. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide, scanning the narrow corridor ahead of us. He gave a slow nod, confirming that I wasn't imagining things. The whispers seemed to swirl around us, growing louder with every step. At first, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, snaking through the cracks in the walls, or our own voices bouncing off the narrow stone. But that explanation didn't hold up. The whispers didn't align with our movements or our conversation. They were deliberate. There was a rhythm to them, an unnerving cadence, like someone was trying to communicate with us, but in a language that made no sense. As we hiked deeper into the canyon, the sun dipped lower, casting everything in an orange-red glow. The shadows danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing. The air grew heavier, oppressive, and cold, despite the heat that still radiated off the sandstone. We stopped to rest for a moment, the whispers momentarily fading. That's when we heard it. Footsteps. They didn't match ours. In fact, they were coming from behind us. The narrow slot canyon stretched back for miles, a seemingly endless corridor of red rock. But when we turned around, no one was there. The canyon was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Mike exchanged a nervous glance with me. We should keep moving, he muttered, his voice lacking the confidence it usually had. We pressed on, picking up the pace. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. They weren't subtle anymore. They were agitated, louder, like a rising tide of voices that ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of our footsteps. It felt like they were surrounding us, closing in, though we still couldn't see anything. The sun was almost gone now, the light rapidly fading. Night came fast in the canyon. We set up camp in one of the few spots wide enough to build a fire. The flames flickered in the tight confines, casting wild shadows on the walls, but the fire did little to ease the growing sense of dread. The whispers had quieted, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. Just as we started to relax, a sound echoed through the canyon. Footsteps again, but this time they were slower, more deliberate, and much closer. We both froze, the crackling of the fire, the only sound breaking the silence. The footsteps circled our camp, moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. We strained our ears, trying to locate the source, but all we could hear were faint voices, so close they might as well have been whispering into our ears. Mike suddenly stiffened, his eyes locked on something above us. "Look," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I followed his gaze and felt a cold chill creep down my spine. Perched high on the narrow canyon walls was a figure, its body twisted in a way that defied logic. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its face was wrong. The eyes were too big, reflecting the firelight with a sickly yellow glow, and its mouth hung open, far too wide, as if it was dislocated. It watched us, unmoving at first, before it began to skitter along the narrow ledges with an inhuman speed, its head twitching unnervingly. We bolted. We grabbed our gear and ran. The whispers now, a cacophony of voices around us, blending into the pounding of our footsteps as we tore through the canyon. The figure didn't follow in the usual sense. It didn't chase us on the ground. Instead, it stayed high above, darting between the walls like a spider, always just ahead or behind, but never quite letting itself be fully seen. I could feel my chest tightening, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The whispers had become deafening, like hundreds of voices all speaking at once, some angry, some pleading, all desperate to be heard. We finally reached a wider part of the canyon, the walls opening up enough to allow a sliver of moonlight to filter down. The voices stopped abruptly. The figure, whatever it was gone. We collapsed in exhaustion, barely able to catch our breath. For a few moments there was silence. Then, just as we began to gather ourselves, something far worse happened. The ground beneath us began to tremble, ever so slightly at first, but then more violently. The walls of the canyon seemed to close in, the once smooth stone now rough and jagged, shifting as if the very earth was alive. And then we saw them, countless figures, emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, their bodies contorted and broken. They crawled along the canyon floor, dragging themselves toward us, with sickening cracks and pops. Their whispers returned, louder than ever, and now I could make out some of the words. Pleas for help, curses, threats. I looked at Mike, and his face was a mask of terror. We had to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The canyon had become a labyrinth, twisting and turning. The path we came from now gone, swallowed by the shifting stone. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the cold, bony hand of one of the figures brushing against my leg, pulling me down into the darkness. I woke up at dawn, alone, lying in the middle of the canyon floor. Mike was gone. The whispers were gone. The figures were gone. But their memory lingers, and I can still hear them in my dreams, calling to me, beckoning me back to the canyon. I haven't been back to the Slot Canyon since, and I never will.
I was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains, aiming for a well-known trail that I had done several times before. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, and the trail wound its way through verdant forests that had become like an old friend over the years. The familiarity of the place always filled me with a sense of calm. The sound of clear streams trickling over smooth rocks, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the peaceful quiet that only the mountains could offer. I was making good time, my mind wandering as my boots crunched along the path, when something caught my eye, a narrow, unmarked trail leading off from the main one. I paused, wiping the sweat from my brow, and squinted down the mysterious path. I'd hiked this trail many times, but I had never seen this offshoot before. It was strange, almost like it had appeared out of nowhere. Curiosity tugged at me, and before I could convince myself otherwise, I veered off the main trail and ventured down the unmarked path. At first, it felt like a typical detour. The ground was uneven, the trail barely worn, but the canopy above was thick, casting long shadows over the forest floor. However, the deeper I went, the more unsettling everything became. The trees here weren't like the ones I'd passed earlier. These were twisted, their trunks gnarled and bent in unnatural shapes, almost as if they had been tortured by some unseen force. The air grew heavy, oppressive, thick with moisture that clung to my skin and made it hard to breathe. A creeping sense of dread began to take root. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the path, but it felt like more than that. The silence was suffocating. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive quiet. It was as if the forest had swallowed every sound, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of my footsteps echoing back at me. The further I walked, the more it felt like I was intruding on something ancient, something that didn't want me there. After about an hour, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I had been walking straight for what felt like miles, yet I kept passing the same crooked tree, a tree with bark so twisted it looked like it had been wrung out like a wet towel. I should have been going in one direction, but somehow, the trail was looping back on itself, bringing me past that damned tree over and over again. Panic surged through me. I stopped and tried to gather my bearings, looking for any signs or landmarks I could use to navigate back to the main trail. But every direction looked the same. I turned to retrace my steps, hoping I could find the fork where I had veered off. But the trail had changed. The path I had taken moments before was gone, replaced by a twisted maze of trees that bent unnervingly in all directions. It didn't make sense. Trails don't just vanish like that. My breath quickened. I was trapped, lost in a forest that seemed to shift around me like a living, breathing thing. I started walking faster, then running, my heart hammering in my chest as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their shadows stretching unnaturally long, casting everything in a murky half-light. The trail beneath my feet twisted and turned, winding endlessly without any sense of direction. As the daylight faded, my desperation grew. That's when I heard it. A faint humming, barely audible at first, carried on the still air. It sounded like someone softly singing a lullaby, the kind that mothers hum to soothe restless children to sleep. But there was something wrong with it, something off about the tune, as if the melody was twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. The sound was drawing me in, pulling me deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed the humming. I told myself it was a person, maybe someone who could help me find my way back. But as I trudged further into the thickening forest, the uneasy in my gut twisted into full-blown fear. The trees closed in tighter, their branches curling over the trail like skeletal hands. The trail beneath me became harder to navigate, the roots of the trees seeming to rise out of the ground, trying to trip me up. Then I saw it, a small clearing shrouded in mist, and in the center of it stood an old, decrepit cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe longer. The wood was rotting, the roof sagging, and vines crawled up its sides like claws gripping its walls. The humming had stopped the moment I saw the cabin, leaving a dead silence that was somehow worse than the sound itself. The air here was colder, the stench of decay thick and sour, and I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, every part of me screaming to turn back. But something about the cabin drew me closer. My feet moved of their own accord, one step at a time, toward the door that hung crookedly on its rusted hinges. As I approached, the door creaked open ever so slowly, as if it had been waiting for me. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I peered inside, but the darkness within was impenetrable. Still, I couldn't stop myself. I stepped over the threshold. The air inside the cabin was thick, damp, and filled with the overwhelming stench of rot. The floor creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to close in around me, making the space feel much smaller than it appeared from the outside. My eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, but as I stood there, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from above. The floor above me groaned under the weight of something heavy, something dragging itself across the floor. I backed away, my heart thundering in my chest, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I froze, terror gripping every fiber of my being. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by the soft, sickening sound of something dragging along the floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared up at the ceiling, waiting for whatever was up there to show itself. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. My eyes darted around the room, looking for any way out, but the windows were boarded up, the walls thick with grime and mold. I was trapped. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, moved ever so slightly, shifting in the corner of my vision. I whipped my head toward it, and there it was, an emaciated figure, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones, standing in the far corner of the room. Its eyes were wide, hollow, and black, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze bore into me, freezing me in place. I bolted. I don't even remember opening the door, but somehow I was outside again, running through the woods, branches tearing at my skin as I sprinted blindly in the dark. I didn't care where I was going anymore. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to escape whatever that thing was. But the trail seemed endless, the trees closing in around me as if trying to swallow me whole. I could still hear the humming, faint but relentless, echoing through the forest. I could feel something behind me, gaining ground, its presence a cold, suffocating weight on my back. After what felt like hours of running, I finally stumbled back onto the main trail. The familiar trees and path were a welcome sight, but the fear still clung to me, thick and oppressive. My legs buckled, and I collapsed onto the dirt, gasping for air, my heart still racing. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I told them about the trail, about the cabin, and about the figure that had chased me through the woods. They exchanged uneasy glances before telling me there was no unmarked trail in that area, no cabin deep in the forest. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that cabin is still out there, waiting for the next poor soul to find it.
The road stretched out before me like a serpent, endless and winding, bathed in the dull glow of my headlights. It was well past midnight, and exhaustion clung to my bones. My fingers gripped the wheel tightly as I fought to keep my eyes open. The rhythmic hum of tires against the asphalt threatened to lull me into a trance. I spotted a dingy, run-down diner just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly, casting an eerie red glow across the cracked and empty parking lot. The signs sputtered on and off, each flicker bathing the diner in a sickly crimson hue that felt more like a warning than an invitation. I should have kept driving, but my stomach gnawed at me, and my head throbbed with fatigue. Against my better judgment, I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The diner's windows were fogged over with grime, and the flickering neon bathed everything in a hellish glow. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming to turn back. Something about the place felt wrong, but the ache in my stomach urged me forward. I pushed open the door, and the faint jingle of a bell overhead greeted me, though it felt more like the toll of a funeral chime. The inside was even worse than the outside, a dusty relic frozen in time, the kind of place that hadn't seen new customers in years. Booths lined the walls, their vinyl seats cracked and peeling. A sticky layer of grease coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and something sour I couldn't quite place. There was only one other person inside, a hunched figure seated at the counter, his back to me. He wore a ragged coat, dark and tattered, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His posture was unnervingly still, as though he had been sitting there for centuries. The waitress, a gaunt, hollow-eyed woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, shuffled over to me with a menu that had seen better days. She didn't even look at me, her eyes fixed on the floor as she handed it to me with trembling hands. Her name tag read Martha, though the letters were faded and nearly illegible. I slid into the nearest booth, my back to the man at the counter, but I could feel his presence, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to weigh down the entire diner. The waitress lingered, her gaze darting nervously between me and the figure. "Coffee and pie," I muttered, trying to shake the unease that was gnawing at my insides. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like I was breathing in the fumes of something long dead. Martha disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the man. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. He hadn't moved, hadn't so much as twitched. He just sat there, hunched over the counter, staring into the depths of a chipped ceramic mug. My coffee and pie arrived, but I couldn't touch them. My appetite had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper. "What's up with him?" The waitress flinched as if I had struck her, her face drained of colour and her eyes widened with fear. She cast a nervous glance at the man before leaning in close. Her voice trembled. "He's been here since last night. Hasn't said a word, hasn't touched his drink. I called the cops, but..." Her voice trailed off as she looked around, her eyes glassy. "They never came." A cold knot formed in my gut. "Since last night?" She nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. "You shouldn't talk to him. People who do don't stay, they don't leave." The way she said it, her voice low and broken, sent a chill up my spine. My eyes flickered back to the man. His stillness was unnatural, like a wax figure, perfectly posed, frozen in time. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to exhaustion and nerves. I focused on my coffee, but I could feel him, watching, waiting. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. My pulse quickened, and my hands felt clammy as I stood up and approached the man at the counter. Each step felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently tapping his shoulder. His coat was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been, as if it had been sitting in a freezer for hours. The waitress screamed, a high-pitched, animalistic sound that pierced the air. "No! Don't!" But it was too late. The moment my fingers brushed the fabric, the air changed. The lights flickered, then dimmed until only the weak glow of the neon sign outside lit the room. The hum of electricity vanished, replaced by an eerie, all-consuming silence. No distant cars, no buzzing lights, just nothing. I looked around in a panic. The waitress was gone, her station behind the counter empty, as if she had never been there at all. My pulse raced, the terror blooming in my chest. And then the man moved. Slowly, impossibly slowly, his head turned toward me. The brim of his hat lifted just enough for me to see beneath it. My heart seized in my chest. There was no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a black, endless void. A pit of nothingness that seemed to suck the light from the room. My legs buckled and I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to listen. The man, or the thing that wore his shape, rose to its feet. It towered over me, the void where its face should have been seeming to grow, to expand, swallowing everything in its path. My skin crawled as it rasped. "I never leave." The words echoed in the empty diner, reverberating inside my skull like nails being hammered into my brain. Its hand, cold, skeletal, and impossibly strong, shot out, grasping my wrist. The touch burned like ice, and I screamed as the flesh on my arm began to peel away, flaking off like old paint, revealing raw, red muscle beneath. My legs finally found their strength, and I tore myself free, stumbling backward, but it followed. The lights flickered violently now, casting jagged shadows as the walls seemed to close in around me. I ran for the door, but the ground beneath me felt unstable, like I was running across quicksand. I looked down in horror to see the floor writhing, pulsing with dark, tendril-like veins that wrapped around my ankles, pulling me back toward the figure. I fell hard, my face slamming into the linoleum floor. Blood filled my mouth as I felt my teeth crack against the surface. I struggled to get up, but the veins held me tight, dragging me closer to the thing that should not exist. It bent down, its face, or lack thereof, mere inches from mine. I could feel the void pulling at my very soul, like it was sucking the life out of me, piece by piece. I screamed as its icy fingers dug into my chest, ripping flesh and bone aside like paper. My vision blurred, the edges of my world darkening as it reached for my heart. And then, darkness. I woke up in my car, drenched in sweat, parked on the side of the highway as if I had never left. But my arm, my wrist still bore the burn of its touch, raw and oozing. And in the distance, flickering faintly against the horizon, was the red glow of that cursed neon sign. It's still out there, waiting.
Late-night diners had always been a haven for me. There was something comforting about the solitude, The way the low hum of a jukebox played forgotten songs, the occasional clatter of dishes echoing from the kitchen. It was a place where time seemed to slow down and I could enjoy the peace. But that night, everything changed. I found myself in a part of town I didn't recognize, a maze of narrow streets and dim streetlights. That's when I saw it, the diner. It looked ancient, forgotten, the kind of place that hadn't seen a renovation in decades. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly green glow on the empty parking lot. Open 24 hours, it read, though no cars were in sight. Hunger gnawed at me, and despite the eerie vibe, I decided to go inside. The bell above the door let out a jarring clang as I entered. The interior was cold, unnaturally cold, and the staleness in the air made my stomach churn. The diner was nearly empty, save for one other customer, a woman sitting alone in a booth at the far corner. Her long jet black hair cascaded over her shoulders, shielding her face. She sat unnaturally still, hands clasped in front of her, as if waiting for something or someone. I couldn't see her face, but the rigidity of her posture sent a chill down my spine. I slid into a booth a few seats away and grabbed the sticky, laminated menu. My eyes scanned the list, but my focus kept drifting toward her. She hadn't moved since I came in, not a twitch, not even a shift of weight. Something was off about her, about the entire place. The waitress shuffled over, a frail older woman with deep lines etched into her face. Her smile was stiff, forced, like it had been glued on. As she stood next to my booth, her eyes briefly flicked to the woman in the corner, and I swore I saw a flash of fear in them. "What'll you have?" Her voice was flat, void of any warmth. I glanced at the woman again, unable to resist. "Who's she?" I nodded toward the corner booth. The waitress stiffened, her eyes widening ever so slightly. Her gaze darted around the room before she leaned in closer to me, her voice dropping to a strained whisper. "Don't worry about her. Keep your head down, eat and leave." I blinked, startled by her intensity. "What do you mean? Is she okay?" The waitress's hand trembled as she placed the notepad down on the table. "You shouldn't have come here," she murmured, her eyes now glued to the floor. She turned quickly and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me with nothing but the oppressive silence of the diner. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the woman once more. She still hadn't moved. Her back was so straight it was unnerving, as if she'd been carved from stone. Every fiber of my being told me to leave, to get up and walk out, but something about her. I was drawn to her. It was like a black hole, pulling me in, compelling me to stay. My food arrived, a plate of greasy eggs and bacon, though it barely looked appetizing. I pushed it around with my fork, the unease growing. I looked up at the waitress as she set down the plate and asked again, "Who is she?" The waitress froze, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the table's edge. "She's been here for years," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Same booth, same seat. No one knows where she came from or why she's here. But once she looks at you..." She swallowed hard, her eyes clouding over with fear. "It's over." I chuckled nervously. "Over? What does that mean?" The waitress didn't respond. She simply turned and hurried back into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my rising sense of dread. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the woman. Her stillness was unnatural, and now, it wasn't just unnerving, it was terrifying. I needed to see her face. I needed to know what the waitress was so afraid of. Maybe it was a morbid curiosity, or maybe something darker, but I had to know. Slowly, I stood up from my booth, my legs trembling beneath me. I approached her booth cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. "Ma'am?" My voice came out shaky, barely a whisper. No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. I edged around the booth, trying to get a better look at her face. Her long hair covered most of it, but as I stepped closer, I noticed the faintest hint of rotting flesh peeking through. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to take one more step. And then, she moved. Her head tilted ever so slightly, and I froze. The air seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping even further. I watched, paralyzed, as her hands slowly unclasped, fingers stiff and contorted as if they hadn't moved in years. Her head turned toward me, revealing her face. My stomach lurched. Her skin was rotten, sagging off her bones in dark, leathery patches. Her eyes were hollow voids, deep pits of nothingness that stared straight through me. But it was her smile that truly made my blood run cold. A wide, grotesque grin, stretched impossibly far across her face, the skin tearing at the corners of her mouth, exposing raw, jagged teeth beneath. I stumbled back, my body trembling uncontrollably. Her smile widened further, splitting her face, the sound of skin tearing filling the air. Blood oozed from the corners of her mouth, dripping down her chin in thick, dark rivulets. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something clawing at my mind, pulling me into the darkness of those bottomless pits. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body refused to move, trapped under the weight of her gaze. I was drowning in her emptiness, the world around me collapsing as the diner seemed to fade away into the black void. Suddenly, her arms shot out with a sickening crack, bones twisting in unnatural angles as her fingers latched onto my wrist. Her grip was ice cold, and I could feel her fingers digging into my flesh, ripping through the skin like knives. Blood poured from the wounds, and the pain was excruciating, but I couldn't pull away. Her voice, raspy and broken, whispered through the silence. "You're mine now," I screamed, finally finding my voice, but it did nothing. Her fingers tightened, twisting and pulling at my flesh, tearing it away in chunks. I could hear the sickening squelch of my skin being peeled from muscle, the wet slap of blood hitting the floor. I collapsed, my legs giving out beneath me as she dragged me closer, her face hovering inches from mine. The smell of decay and rot filled my nostrils, and her grin widened even further, splitting her jaw open with a wet, bone-snapping sound. Her teeth, jagged yellowed shards, were inches from my throat. In one swift motion, she lunged, her teeth sinking into my neck with a sickening crunch. Agony ripped through me as I felt her tearing through muscle and sinew, her mouth filling with my blood. The world spun, darkness creeping in from the edges of my vision. As my blood pooled around me, her eyes locked onto mine, that horrible grin never faltering. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her face, that grotesque, rotting face, smiling down at me as she fed. And then, nothing.
The moment I walked into the diner, the greasy smell of fried food mixed with the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke hit me. It was just before midnight, and the place was deserted, except for the waitress, who stood behind the counter, idly flipping through a magazine. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow over the cracked linoleum floors and worn-out vinyl seats. It was a far cry from a cozy roadside stop, but I wasn't there for ambiance. I had heard the stories. The midnight special was a challenge, a dare passed around by the locals. Supposedly, if you stayed late enough and asked for it, the cook would whip up something that would test the limits of your stomach and sanity. Most people chalked it up to a gimmick to get some laughs out of drunk late-night patrons, but no one I knew had ever finished it. Some even claimed that those who tried ended up sick, or worse. I wasn't one to back down from a challenge though, and that night I was feeling especially adventurous. Maybe it was the long drive or the emptiness in my gut, but when I pulled into the parking lot, I made up my mind. I'd be the one to conquer the midnight special. I sat down at the counter and caught the waitress's eye. She was older, her face worn with years of working the graveyard shift, her eyes dull and tired. When I asked for the midnight special, she paused, her fingers tightening around the edges of her magazine. "You sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Her voice was low, almost cautious. "Most don't make it to the end." I gave a cocky grin. thinking it was all part of the shtick. I'm sure. The waitress didn't respond, but something in her expression darkened as she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. The air in the diner felt heavier now, like the walls were pressing in on me. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more insistent, and with each passing second, the temperature seemed to drop. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves. The diner was just old, run down, nothing to be worried about. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I glanced around, feeling as though I wasn't quite alone. The only sound besides the clock was the distant clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen. No voices, no movement, just that cold, creeping silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned, carrying a plate in her hands. She set it down in front of me without a word, her eyes never meeting mine. The burger was enormous, dripping with grease, the bun soggy and stained with the juices. Piled next to it were fries, limp and cold, like they had been sitting out for too long. But it was the smell that hit me the hardest, pungent, metallic, almost like copper, almost like blood. "Midnight special," she said flatly, her voice devoid of any emotion. She turned on her heel and walked back to the kitchen without waiting for a response, leaving me alone with the plate. I stared at the burger, my stomach churning already. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The patty was dark, almost black, and it glistened under the flickering lights. I hesitated, but I had come this far. I wasn't about to chicken out now. I picked it up, the greasy bun squishing in my hands, and took a bite. The taste hit me immediately, and I had to fight back the urge to spit it out. The meat was tough, rubbery, with an overwhelming metallic tang. It didn't taste like beef, at least not any beef I'd ever had. The aftertaste was acrid, burning the back of my throat as I swallowed. I forced down another bite, grimacing. The whisper started then. At first it was faint, barely audible, like someone murmuring just behind my ear. I jerked my head around, but the diner was empty. The waitress hadn't returned. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, a hissing, rasping sound that seemed to crawl into my skull. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the burger, but with each bite, the whispers grew more intense. They weren't words exactly, more like guttural sounds, low and urgent, as if something was trying to communicate but couldn't form the language. My skin prickled and my stomach roiled with each chew. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. That's when I heard it clearly, a voice, low and raspy, calling my name. "Closer, come closer." I froze, the bite of food halfway to my mouth. The whisper wasn't just in my head anymore, it was real, tangible, right there beside me. Slowly, I turned toward the plate, my heart thudding in my chest. The burger moved. I dropped it immediately, watching in horror as the patty began to shift, undulating like something was trapped beneath the surface. The fries next to it twitched, tiny jerks as though they were struggling to come to life. My stomach twisted into knots as I stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic now, filling my ears, pressing into my mind. "Eat. More." I shot up from my seat, the chair screeching across the floor. My legs felt weak and I could barely stand as the whispers continued to wrap around me, suffocating, relentless. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open with a bang and the waitress stepped out. But something was different. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were wide, too wide, bulging from her skull, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque, unnatural grin, her lips peeling back to reveal jagged, broken teeth. "Don't leave now," she rasped, her voice a broken croak. "You haven't finished." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The burger on the plate writhed now, splitting open down the middle as something slimy and dark slithered out from within. It was small at first, but as it crawled across the table, it grew, its form stretching, twisting into something monstrous. It was a mass of black, writhing flesh, dripping with a thick, oozing substance that smelled of rot and decay. Tendrils sprouted from its body, snaking across the table, reaching for me. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen in place, locked in terror. The waitress laughed, a wet, gurgling sound that sent chills down my spine. Her body began to contort, her bones cracking and shifting beneath her skin. Her neck twisted at an impossible angle, her eyes still fixed on me, that horrifying grin never faltering. The tendrils wrapped around my ankles, pulling me toward the table. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat burned, my mind a whirlwind of panic as the black mass grew larger, its shape ever-changing, shifting between something human and something far worse. My skin burned where the tendrils touched, searing pain shooting up my legs as they dragged me closer to the plate. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The whispers were louder now, deafening, a cacophony of voices all screaming for me to eat, to submit. The black mass reared up, looming over me, its surface bubbling and writhing as it split open to reveal a maw lined with rows of jagged teeth, dripping with a thick yellow bile. The smell was overpowering, like rotting meat and sulfur. My vision blurred, my head spinning as I fought against the nausea rising in my throat. It lunged. The pain was immediate, blinding. Its teeth sank into my shoulder, ripping through flesh and muscle with a sickening crunch. Blood poured from the wound, hot and thick, soaking through my clothes. I screamed, the sound raw and guttural, but there was no one to hear. The thing chewed, tearing chunks of flesh from my body as it fed, its tendrils wrapping tighter around my legs, pulling me closer, closer to its gaping maw. My vision dimmed, the world spinning as the blood drained from my body. I collapsed to the floor, my body limp and broken. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the waitress, her grin impossibly wide, her eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient, as she whispered, "Welcome to the midnight special."
It was a foggy, unsettling afternoon when my friends and I made the worst decision of our lives. We decided to try Randonautica. We were all skeptics, the kind of people who scoffed at the internet stories about dark energies and eerie coincidences tied to the app. It was just a game, right? What could possibly go wrong? We sat in a circle watching the app choose our location, with a blend of excitement and sarcasm. The intent we set: mystery, something harmless, something fun. The destination it gave us was less than 5 miles away, tucked deep into a part of the woods none of us had ever been to. As we piled into the car, our laughter grew quieter. The further we drove, the more the atmosphere shifted. The trees became thicker, the light dimmer, as if the sun itself had decided to abandon this part of the world. The road soon became little more than a dirt trail, barely visible on the map. Every bump sent a shock wave of unease through the car, but we pressed on, too stubborn to turn back. None of us wanted to admit how bad of an idea this was. After what felt like an eternity, the trail opened into a clearing. In the middle of that clearing stood a shack, or what was left of one. The red paint was peeling off the walls, curling back in long strips like flayed skin, revealing rotten wood beneath. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a place that should have been swallowed by the earth long ago. My stomach turned, but we parked the car anyway. The silence in the air was thick, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were watching us, waiting. No one wanted to get out of the car, but we had come this far. Curiosity gnawed at us, even as dread slithered through our veins. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale in the dim light. We tried to laugh it off, but it came out weak and hollow. My heart pounded in my chest as we approached the shack, the crunch of leaves under our feet louder than it should have been. Every step felt like a mistake. The door was barely hanging on its rusted hinges. I hesitated before pushing it open, my fingers trembling. The moment the door creaked inward, a wave of stench hit us so hard it was like walking into a wall. It was the smell of decay, thick and rotten, mixed with something metallic. Blood. I gagged but forced myself to step inside. The air was thick, damp, and suffocating. The first thing that caught my eye was the blood, splattered across the walls, dried into dark, cracked streaks. It was like someone had painted the walls with it. My heart raced as I looked around the room. The source of the smell became painfully clear. In the center of the room was a large, splintered wooden table, covered in tools that made my blood run cold. Butcher's tools, rusted, blood-stained, and horrifyingly real. But there were no bodies, no signs of what had happened here, just the remnants of violence. So much blood, more than I could comprehend. My breath quickened, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. Beside me, my friend Jamie moved toward a large, moldy tarp draped over something in the corner. We should have left. We should have run, but she pulled it back. The pile beneath was something out of a nightmare. Severed limbs, arms, legs, fingers, some fresh, still oozing, dark, thick blood, others decaying, the flesh rotting off in sickening chunks. Flies buzzed around the pile, feasting on the dead. And the worst part? The limbs weren't from animals. They were human. My stomach twisted into knots as the reality of what we had walked into sank in. A sense of wrongness hung over the place, like the air itself was tainted. My head pounded as I tried to understand what kind of monster could have done this. Then, from the back room, a low, guttural growl echoed. It was deep, vibrating through the walls, through my bones. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound wasn't human. We should have run. God, we should have run the moment we heard it. But we didn't. The door to the back room creaked open slowly, the shadows inside stirring. Then, he stepped out. He was massive, towering over us, his hulking frame blocking out the fading light. His face was hidden beneath a mask. No, not a mask. A twisted patchwork of human skin, stitched together with wire, covering his face like some grotesque mockery of a person. His eyes, red, bloodshot, gleamed with a madness so raw, I could feel it crawling under my skin. In his hand, he held a massive cleaver, the blade crusted with dried blood. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, my body screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. Then he charged. The world exploded into chaos. We bolted, crashing through the door, running into the woods like terrified animals. I could hear his footsteps behind us, heavy, relentless, getting closer with every step. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. In the blur of branches and undergrowth, Jamie stumbled. She hit the ground hard, a scream ripping from her throat as she twisted to look back. I didn't stop. I should have, but I didn't. I kept running, even as her screams tore through the air. The cleaver came down with a sickening crunch that echoed through the trees. Her screams turned to gurgles, then silence. but the footsteps didn't stop. They were still coming. I pushed myself harder, branches clawing at my face, my arms, the pain barely registering. The only thing I could think about was getting to the car. The monster's growls, his footsteps, were right behind me, close enough that I could feel his hot breath on my neck. I don't remember how I made it back to the car. All I remember is throwing myself inside, slamming the door shut, and peeling out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't know how long I drove before I finally stopped. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the wheel. I was covered in dirt, blood, not mine, Jamie's blood. I never reported what happened. I couldn't. No one would believe me. A week later, they found her body, or what was left of it. She had been dissected like an animal, her limbs missing, her torso flayed open, organs arranged neatly beside her like some kind of sick display. The police called it a ritualistic killing, but they never found the killer. But I know he's still out there, waiting.
We were trying to be edgy, bored, thrill-seeking teenagers looking for a way to scare ourselves stupid. So, we did what all reckless kids do. We downloaded Randonautica and set our intent to fear. It was midnight, the perfect time for a bad idea. We huddled in my car, the glow of our phones casting eerie shadows across our faces as we waited for the app to generate a location. After a few moments, the screen flashed and the coordinates appeared. My stomach twisted when I saw where it wanted to take us, the outskirts of town, to a cemetery that hadn't been visited in decades. The place had a reputation, sure, stories of hauntings, whispers of people who went in but never came out. But we weren't superstitious. At least, that's what we kept telling ourselves. The drive was filled with nervous laughter, the kind that barely hides the fear bubbling beneath the surface. The moon was full, casting long, sinister shadows across the narrow, cracked road as we approached the cemetery gates. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. The wind had died, and all that remained was the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. We parked at the edge of the cemetery, the rusty gates looming ahead, like the gaping maw of a beast waiting to devour us. The old tombstones jutted from the earth like broken teeth, their inscriptions long since worn away by time and neglect. No one came here anymore. That should have been enough to send us back, but we were too far gone, too determined to prove we weren't scared. The app's coordinates led us to a particular grave, a strange one, set apart from the others. The stone was smoother than the rest, almost unnaturally so, with the name weathered into obscurity. What made it worse were the symbols carved into the ground around it. They were jagged, crude markings, their lines twisted and sharp like claws. Scattered around were candles, their wax long since melted into puddles of forgotten rituals. My heart began to pound, the chill in the air biting through my skin, but I forced myself to keep moving. Just some bored kids, I muttered, though my voice was tight with tension. Probably some wannabe Satanists messing around. We all nodded, pretending to believe it, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The ground felt too soft beneath our feet, the air too thick, and every breath we took was harder than the last. Then it happened. The earth beneath us trembled. It started as a low vibration, barely noticeable at first, but then it grew, a deep rumbling that made my stomach turn. Mark, standing closest to the grave, gasped. His eyes widened in horror, and before he could speak, a deep, guttural moan rose from beneath the ground. It was a sound I can never forget, like the last desperate cry of something long dead. Then, the soil began to shift. The ground writhed like it was alive, And before we could react, a skeletal hand burst through the dirt. Its bones were yellowed, brittle looking, but impossibly strong as it clawed at the air, desperate to escape its grave. I screamed, stumbling backward, my legs trembling as the world seemed to spin around me. But Mark, he didn't move. He was frozen, rooted to the spot in shock as the hand shot forward, gripping his ankle with a strength that belied its decayed form. "Mark!" I shouted, rushing toward him. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, but it was no use. The hand yanked him toward the grave, dragging him through the loose soil with unnatural force. His face twisted in terror, his eyes wide and wild as he tried to kick free. But more hands, rotted, skeletal, emerged from the earth. They tore at his flesh with their decayed fingers, peeling his skin away in long, ragged strips. Blood poured from the wounds, thick and black in the moonlight. His screams filled the night, raw and agonized, as they dragged him down toward the gaping hole that was now his grave. The earth opened wider, revealing more than just hands. Writhing bodies, emaciated, pale, their skin clinging to their bones, rose from the pit. Their eyes were hollow, lifeless, but their hunger was real. They grabbed at Mark, their fingers sinking into his flesh, tearing, ripping, feasting. I watched, helpless, as they began to devour him. His body convulsed as chunks of his flesh were torn away, his bones snapping under the force of their bites. Blood sprayed from his mouth as he screamed, a sickening, gurgling sound that cut through the stillness of the night. I could hear the wet tearing of his muscles, the crunch of his bones as they ripped him apart, piece by piece. His arms went limp, his eyes rolling back in his head, but they didn't stop. They kept pulling him down, deeper into the grave, until all that was left was his twisted, mangled torso, disappearing into the earth. And then the ground closed. It was as if nothing had ever happened. The soil settled, the air went still, and the grave looked untouched. Mark was gone. I stood there, my mind racing, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. His blood still stained the ground, seeping into the dirt, but there was no trace of him left. I wanted to scream, to cry, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, my chest tight, as if something was squeezing the life out of me. Then I felt it, a presence, cold, heavy, like icy fingers wrapping around my neck. It was behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it. Its breath on the back of my neck, rancid and foul. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin prickling with fear. I could hear something, a whisper, low and guttural, crawling into my ears. "Join us!" I bolted. My legs were numb with terror. As I sprinted through the cemetery, dodging tombstones that seemed to reach out for me, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers. They were everywhere, surrounding me, growing louder with every step I took. My vision blurred, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran for the gate. But I wasn't alone. I could hear it behind me. Heavy footsteps, shuffling through the dirt, something dragging across the ground. It was following me. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking, waiting for me to stumble, to fall. The gate was just ahead, but my legs were failing. I pushed harder, the sound of it closing in behind me, its breath ragged and wet. I collapsed just as I reached the gate, my body giving out beneath me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The whispers stopped, and the air went still again. I crawled through the gate, dragging myself back to the car, my entire body trembling. When I finally looked back at the cemetery, it was empty. Mark was never found. The police searched the cemetery the next morning, but the grave was undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. It was as if he had never existed. But I know better. I know what I saw. I know that they're still out there, waiting for the next fool to set their intent to fear. I don't visit cemeteries anymore.
It started as a fun, innocent idea, using randonautica to find hidden spots in our town, seeking a thrill in the mundane. We'd done it before, but the places it took us were usually boring. A random park, a dead-end street, an abandoned lot. This time, we decided to up the stakes. We set our intention to secret. What kind of secrets could this app uncover? Maybe we'd find a forgotten spot, or an abandoned house filled with old trinkets. But when the coordinates popped up on the screen, the atmosphere in the car changed. The app was leading us deep into the countryside, far from any place we had been before. We passed fields that seemed to stretch on forever, the occasional patch of woods breaking up the endless horizon. The road narrowed, turning into gravel as it led us further into the unknown. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through the trees. Eventually, we reached our destination, the ruins of an old mansion. I'd heard about this place. Local legend said it had burned down decades ago with the family still inside. Some said it was haunted, that the souls of those who perished were trapped in the wreckage, doomed to relive their final moments in a twisted loop of terror. But we weren't the kind of people who believed in ghost stories. Or at least, we thought we weren't. The building was nothing but charred stone walls and broken windows, overgrown with vines and moss, barely visible beneath the shadows of towering trees. The roof was long gone, and the floor had crumbled into piles of ash and debris. It was desolate, abandoned, but there was something more to it, something that made my skin crawl the moment we stepped out of the car. The air felt heavy, thick with an energy I couldn't explain, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us. We entered through a gaping hole in the wall, the charred remnants of the doorframe framing our way in. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped by at least 10 degrees. The cold air wrapped around me, making it hard to breathe. My friends felt it too. We exchanged uneasy glances but laughed it off. We'd come this far, no turning back now. The inside was worse than the outside. The walls were scorched black, and the floor was littered with debris. But what really unnerved me was the silence. There were no sounds of birds, no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of our footsteps echoing through the ruins, each one making me feel more exposed, more vulnerable. As we moved deeper into the mansion, that's when I started hearing it. Whispers, low and indecipherable, like voices carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw the looks on my friends' faces. They heard it too. The whispers were so faint, we couldn't make out the words, but they were there, weaving through the air like poison. Still, we pushed forward, our curiosity winning out over common sense. We told ourselves it was just the wind playing tricks on us. But the further we went, the louder the whispers became. It was no longer just noise. The words were becoming clearer, taking shape in the silence. "Turn back." I froze, my heart racing, as the voice slithered through my mind. It wasn't like someone was speaking. It felt more like the words were being etched directly into my thoughts, branding themselves into my brain. I looked at my friends, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. We should have left right then, but we didn't. We were stupid. In the center of the ruins was a massive fireplace, blackened with soot, its stone frame towering above us like the entrance to a crypt. As I approached, something caught my eye. Scratch marks on the bricks, deep and jagged, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. The marks were frantic, desperate, and they sent a chill crawling down my spine. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the stone. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell hard, tumbling through darkness, the world spinning around me as I plummeted into the abyss. When I hit the bottom, the impact knocked the wind out of me, My body screamed in pain, but I was alive. That was all that mattered. For a moment, I lay there trying to catch my breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, the smell hit me. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, a suffocating miasma that clung to my skin and filled my lungs. I gagged, struggling to keep from vomiting as I forced myself to my feet. My head spun as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. I was in a basement, though basement didn't feel like the right word. It was more like a crypt. The walls were damp, the stones slick with moisture, and the air was cold. Colder than the surface, like the chill of death itself. But that wasn't the worst part. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one filled with something horrible. Severed tongues floated in murky liquid, their surfaces bloated and gray. Eyeballs, disembodied and clouded with decay, stared out at me from their glass prisons. Some jars held chunks of flesh, jagged and torn, suspended in formaldehyde. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was looking at. These weren't animals. These were human remains. And then the whispers returned. Louder now, clearer. They were no longer telling me to turn back. They had a new command. Join us. My heart pounded in my chest as the words wrapped around me like chains, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I looked down and saw that I wasn't alone. Bodies, rotting, skeletal, were piled up around me, their skin stretched tight over bones, their eyes sunken into hollow sockets. Their faces were twisted in expressions of eternal agony, their mouths moving in unison with the whispers. Their dead eyes seemed to watch me, follow me, their bony fingers twitching, as if they were waiting for me to join them. I stumbled backward, my legs weak with terror, but as I moved, one of the corpses shifted. Its head turned slowly, impossibly, the creaking of bone filling the air as it locked its milky eyes onto mine. Then it moved. Its hand, skeletal and dripping with decayed flesh, reached out, its fingers curling around my ankle with a grip that sent waves of cold pain shooting through my leg. I screamed, kicking at the hand, but it wouldn't let go. The other bodies stirred, dragging themselves across the floor with sickening slowness, their dead fingers clawing at the dirt as they reached for me. Their voices grew louder, the whispers turning into a cacophony of tortured cries. I kicked harder, my foot connecting with the skull of the corpse gripping my leg, shattering the bone with a sickening crack. But the hand still held on. Desperate, I tore at the fingers, prying them off one by one until I was free. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the blood-soaked floor as I tried to run. The bodies were coming now, dragging themselves toward me, their bones snapping and cracking with every movement, their mouths gaping open in soundless screams. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I clawed my way up through the hole I'd fallen into. The whispers followed me, relentless, wrapping around my mind, suffocating me. My fingers dug into the dirt, nails breaking as I pulled myself out of the pit. When I finally reached the surface, I collapsed, gasping for air. My friends were gone. The ruins were silent again, but the coldness remained. I stumbled to my feet and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. I never told anyone what I saw that night. No one would believe me, but the whispers, they never stopped. Every night when the world is quiet, I can hear them, calling me back, urging me to return. And I know deep down that one day I won't be able to resist.